Okay, hello everyone. I am Fransisco Cardoso. I'm working as a freelance journalist on behalf of Moving Along. And it's a great pleasure to have Professor Andrew Leeds here. And we are going to talk about his second career, if I may say so. So, Andrew, first of all, thank you very much really for taking time for chatting with me. And we are supposed to talk about your new book, Brainspotting, which is a great, really, piece of work. But before we actually start discussing some of the questions that I have to relate to the book itself, I was wondering, you have had and still have, it's not the most brilliant, but one of the most brilliant careers in the field of Parkinson's disease and movement disorders. So your contribution to our field has been tremendous. So it really has changed the way we approach Parkinson's disease. So it may be a bit surprising to those who do not know you in person, and I have the pleasure to be a friend of yours, that you have now taken this second career as a serious writer. So before Brainspotting, you have published Mentored by a Madman and also Brazil That Never Was. So how did this happen?
Well, as you know, Chico, when you're a doctor, you're not allowed to talk about yourself. So as I came towards the end of my career, I wanted to write something about me. That was the inspiration of these three books, really. They're all types of memoir. I hesitate to use the word memoir because most doctors' memoirs are dry, turgid, and uninteresting. So, Mentored by a Madman, I called a fantasia, taking the musical term. And this latest book is really a plea to bring back so-called neurology. It's a polemic. It's to try and avoid younger doctors developing burnout. It's a romance in a way, but it's how I was taught medicine and how I think it should still be practiced.
Yeah, the way I read Brainspotting was as a love letter to neurology. Perhaps a neurology of a bygone era. There was this feeling of somehow a nostalgia.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of emphasis on place in all my books. So I have a nostalgia for places that became very significant. For example, dead hospitals that have been knocked down and no longer exist, or childhood memories of the docks in Liverpool. My father used to take me to watch the ships coming in from Brazil. So place and memory are both very important, right?
Right, but again, as a matter of fact, I can recognize that in this book as well, when you speak about birdwatching in your early years of life, and then we'll get back to that because I'd like really to explore what would be the relationship between birdwatching and soulful neurology. But in this particular case, I somehow have been able to get this feeling that there is a sort of almost lost type of neurology. So if I try to find out a common thread to all these chapters, because they can be read apart, as a matter of fact, but what in my mind, that is what puts them together is this nostalgia for a lost or almost lost, hopefully, neurology.
Yeah, I mean, the Brainspotting is actually Dr. Faustus in reverse. It's like trying to become a good doctor, but not lose your soul, which we begin to do when we start medical studies. So got the story of Dr. Faustus. I mean, I think what I describe is still mainstream neurology. I mean, I think most neurologists agree that listening attentively is transformational, it's therapeutic, and it, of course, gives you the diagnosis in more than 70% of cases without the need for any technology. So patients want to be heard, and if they don't get heard, they complain, and they go and see holistic and complementary therapists. So there's nothing revolutionary about what I'm trying to describe. I'm just trying to get back to basics. The neurological examination is still very important. It helps us to localize the lesion, but it's important for another reason, because it gives us as neurologists the opportunity to touch our patients. And touch is transformational. And that's why teleconsultations will never help healing, because the laying on of hands is the oldest sense, is the oldest form of healing. And although it's very difficult now with political correctness, all this sort of thing to do it, we as neurologists still have the opportunity to do that through the exam. We may have to disguise our touch in the form of a formal examination, but we can still do it. So the book is really starting with that, and then it's going further in the way I was taught at medical school. I was taught that when you see a patient, nothing should be lost on you. Everything you want to know. You don't just want to make a diagnosis. You want to know everything about that patient, his life, what his illness means to him. And in order to do that, you have to be quite cultured. And you can't just rely on knowledge. So you'll never become a good doctor if you spend all your life in the library and you don't get out there and learn about samba and all the different things that make up the life of our patients. And I think it's this, I have emphasized that dimension a little bit in this book, that once you're a neurologist, you can never leave neurology behind. And wherever you go, whatever you do, you have a clinical gaze, which is influenced by your training. But you can use that to your advantage, not just to spot diseases on the London Underground, but actually to, for example, if you meet one of your patients in the street with their clothes on, you can talk to them about something other than their illness. You can talk to them as if they were a member of your family. And this is what, this is what. So, of course, in a sense, it means a little bit on primary healthcare. General practitioners are the experts at this if they do it properly. But we shouldn't lose it in neurology either. It's partly, we are not just diagnosis makers. We have to heal people, get them better. What's, I think, been a very healthy development in neurology is that instead of, when I started, before it was help our colleagues to make difficult diagnoses, the one we walked away, we didn't really do anything as far as treatment's concerned. But that, of course, has changed for the good, so that now all rehabilitation, long-term follow-up of patients has become part of the job of a neurologist, and that's all for the good, really. So, what I think has changed for the worse is that young doctors, and it's our fault that they don't do this, everything that's changed is not the fault of young doctors, it's the fault of us, the teachers of medical school, the chairman of neurology departments, for not emphasizing on the importance of acquiring data at the bedside. So I think that my residents are excellent at interpreting and inferring what the data tells them, but they're not as good as we were at collecting the data. So it's an issue not to inference or communication. They're better than we were at communication, and they're just as good at practical skills, doing lumbar functions and so on. I think the weakness with the modern young neurologist is in bedside clinical acquisition. And if you don't collect this data, then you're missing out. And, with all the modern technology of US medicine, there were 18 million diagnostic errors last year. Most of them occur because the physician did not examine the patient. This is the commonest cause for medical legal problems in the States.
Yeah, I agree that we, teachers, mentors, we are responsible for how the new generations they come out. But don't you believe that there is a zeitgeist of the entire medicine that relies more and more on automatic decision-making process, algorithms, too much emphasis perhaps on diagnostic tests and so on. And one of the things that I find brilliant in your book is precisely to get back to the basics.
Yeah, without being paternalistic, this is a problem. I think we've kind of replaced doctor knows what's best with a sort of robotic, slavish adherence to algorithms and guidelines. I was always taught that if you need to break the law in order to help your patient as a doctor, you should do that. So sometimes you have to go against the regulations of your profession and the standard guidelines that we're all supposed to follow. And this is, of course, very difficult to do now because we're all frightened of being sued. We're all frightened of losing our licenses. And all these other reasons which make medicine more and more risk averse, less and less interesting, and dominated also by, quite frankly, useless scales. So I go into, if you go into my hospital and you look what's going on in the outpatient hospital department, what you'll see is the patients all filling in scales, hundreds of scales. And they then have to take these into the doctor. And I don't know what the doctors do. They probably collect data for research. But I think it detracts from the doctor-patient relationship as does electronic health records, where you're having to record everything on the computer as you're trying to talk to the patient. So I think these things are not, I don't see them as revolutionary. I just see them as good medical practice, but it's getting harder for all of us to carry out good the sort of medical practice that we would like to practice. And this, it doesn't matter if you're in the private sector where you're driven by financial issues, or whether you're in the public health system where you're driven by laws and regulations set up by governments and public functionaries. So I agree with you. I mean, I think that the hospital has become more like a factory and less like a sanctuary. And I think that's a great shame.
Yeah, for the sake of the zeros of our conversation, in one of the chapters, Professor Lees describes how he used to do with his students. So the hospital where he still see patients occasionally and we still affiliate the National Hospital in London, it is near a tube, a metro underground station. So occasionally he would take his students to take the circle line, and then
Takes an hour.
Yeah,
an hour around it.
And what would you ask them? He describes that in this
These were second-year medical students. First of all, they were instructed to be as invisible as possible. So that what they definitely mustn't do is make the commuters on the tube aware that they were studying. So they had to be like spies, really. What they were asked to look at was body language, really. look at the facial expressions, and of course take notice of the clothes, try to guess the occupation, if the commuters were speaking, listen to their voices, and learn from their voices. When they got off the tube, obviously have a look at their walk to see if there was anything unusual about the walk. So when we got back after this hour's journey around the Circle Line, we went back up to the ward, to the day room, and they were asked to describe some of the individuals they'd seen, rather like a witness to a crime on the underground might have done, so that they were not expected to make diagnoses. In fact, I discouraged them. What it was really was an exercise in learning to observe nuanced body language, and all the things that we know are useful in neurology, because neurology appeals to artists as well as bird watchers, because many of the great neurologists were visionaries who could see and paint. Charcot, for example, is one. Gowers was a great illustrator. So
I would add that especially movement disorders are fuse prone to observation.
Particularly because we have the good fortune that many of the physical signs that are very important for us to make as diagnosis syndrome, you can see in the street. So as James Parkinson did with his original descriptions in the essay of the shaking palsy. The other technique I would use when we had no patients to show was to take the group of students into a room where a patient was there, but we had gone off for tests. So if a patient had gone down for a scan, we'd go into the room and I'd ask the students to tell me what they could see and what they could deduce from the accoutrements, the paraphernalia that the patient had left. Was there a spirometer that might suggest myasthenia gravis? Was there a patch suggesting double vision? So then these were all really exercises in noticing, learning to notice. And I think it's much more useful to notice people than go to an art gallery and walk around an art gallery and saying, oh, this patient's got a dystonia and all that, because you can become a good observer of paintings, then you become an art critic, like John Berger, who wrote a wonderful book called A Fortunate Man about a rural general practitioner, which influenced me greatly when I was training. Or you could become a doctor. And if you want to be a doctor, you need to observe patients and what they do and how they behave.
In one of the chapters of the Brainspotting, Professor Lisi describes that in these teenager years, as a matter of fact, we took up on bird watching, and that's how you connect with neurology.
Yeah, I was always drawn to the natural sciences. I like biology, and then I like the arts. And I couldn't really find a way of reconciling my passion for art, my passion for science, or at least the natural sciences, until my parents edged me towards medicine. I'm very grateful to them for doing that. When I was a teenager, I started to study birds, first garden birds. And I was colorblind and tone deaf. So these were two big disadvantages for bird watching. So I couldn't appreciate the subtle colors of the bird, and I couldn't tell the sound of the voice. So perhaps bird, you might think with those deficits, bird watching might not be a very good choice of a hobby for a young boy. But I learned to study the gestalt of birds. It's called the jizz, so that you can recognize a bird by its movement, in its body language, how it drops, how it moves. So I was able to compensate for that. And I also noticed something which I later was explained to me, that when a bird was camouflaged or in cover, I could see it more clearly than people with normal color vision. So the advantage of being colorblind seemed to give me some contextual advantages over normal. And I learned one of the bird watchers who I used to go bird watching with told me much later that during World War II, colorblind people were used to identify camouflage tanks during warfare because they could actually see the camouflage better than normal color vision. So I think that's what I was probably using when I was compensating my deficits. And of course, bird watching is irrelevant to neurology in the sense that nothing about birds really has a relevance to the treating of neurological disease. But I learned many things from it. First of all, it taught me that careful observation was very important, that you had to observe and pay attention to trivia and detail. And it also taught me the importance that it's not just what you see, you've got to be able to describe it in written word. So you have to not only see the bird, but you have to try and describe what that bird's doing, which is very relevant to movement disorders, for example. So those were two things which I think gave me an advantage when I started my medical studies. The other advantage was that I joined a naturalist society, and that this put me in contact with older, learned individuals who were happy givers. So they were very happy to teach me. And I learned the importance of mentorship long before I went to medical school. And got my own medical mentors later on. So it introduced me to the importance of mentors, really, in my own life.
In his answer right now, he alluded to the importance of words. And one of the striking things, not only about this particular book, but his previous books, is how exquisitely well written they are. So you clearly have a lot of words, which leads me then to another aspect of this book, because you mentioned Holmes. And of course, Holmes is the prototype of the observer. But Holmes is a literary character. So, and maybe you could address as well Dr. Nkudi, one of your mentors. And I must tell you and share this with our viewers that I regret so much that I didn't have the opportunity to meet him, to get to know him because of the common interest in Marcel Proust. So you write extremely well, Andrea. And of course, that this requires love of letters, but also training. How did this come about in you?
Well, I probably got some genetic, although nobody in my family is a doctor. My father was a teacher of English at a grammar school in the north of England. And I think I inherited his love for literature. So he encouraged me to read a lot. If you want to be a good writer, you have to be a good reader too. You can't be a good writer if you don't read. You have to have a very big background. So the first influence with my writing was certainly my father. I was very fortunate when I started my residency in neurology to have two wonderful mentors, Gerald Stern, you know very well, and William Woody, you've mentioned. William was very much a Renaissance man. We talked about Proust, we talked about ceramics, we talked about George Stevens, the inventor of the railway, our everyday ward round. So it was part of the ward round. But one day when we were leaving the ward, and I was pretty young and junior and very impressionistic about teachers and a bit nervous. That, in those days, the career track for neurology in the United Kingdom was very tough. Only 300 neurologists in the whole of the country. And if you blotted your copybook, or if you did something wrong, out. There was no second comeback. So happily, that's much better now. It's changed, and the system is much better. So I had to be careful. As we were coming out of the ward, he said to me, "Lee, neurology is deadly serious, but it must also be fun." And I try to tell the residents that it must be fun, because if it's not fun, if you're not enjoying it, you'll burn out and you won't finish the course. And during your career, you may be finding this yourself. At various stages, you have to reinvent yourselves. You have to change direction in order to keep the interest and the curiosity, which is you have to have as a neurologist. So that was one of the things William Goody said. And then the other thing he said is, you will learn neurology from your patients. Spend as much time as you can at the bedside. Listen to what they say. If your seniors tell you what the diagnosis is, go to the library and look up a little bit about that particular disease. And then he said, don't spend too much time reading textbooks of neurology. What I would recommend you is that you read In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust. And he partly said that because he had a particular interest in time of neurology. So he had a sort of specialist interest in that. But there's no question that Proust was a sort of neuroscientist, clinical neuroscientist, if you read his writing. And the other recommendation, which was much easier for me to accept, because of course it took me 30 years to read Alain Richard, John Perriot. I was almost closing in on the later stages of my career before I got through Proust. But he also suggested that I read the Sherlock Holmes canon. And of course, as most English schoolboys read Sherlock Holmes, so I'd read a lot of it already, but I went back and read it. And Sherlock Holmes, of course, uses abductive reasoning to get to the problem. So this is not deduction or induction. It's reasoning. It's not deductive or inductive reasoning. It's a kind of informed guesswork. It's a kind of guesswork. So you can collect the facts, and then you, instead of being a prophet who looks forwards, you try to look backwards based on the information you collected. And that's of course, Holmes used that to solve crimes. But we, as doctors, use this method to make diagnoses. That's how we work on a system of semiotics. We collect physical signs. We know what those physical signs suggest. And we put them together to try and give us the answers to what we're searching. So I've continued to read Holmes, the works of Sherlock Holmes throughout my career. And in the book, there are examples of, one particular example of how one of Sherlock Holmes's stories led us to the diagnosis of a very unusual movement disorder case.
Thank you. 5 minutes now, but I have really to thank you very much for taking your time. This has been a very entertaining and pleasant conversation. So thank you so much. And all of this is in the book. And more than that, as a matter of fact, so I would really urge everyone, especially the young colleagues, to really read Brainspotting. It has been tremendously entertaining, and I learned so much out of it. So thank you so much for your time again.